the field of Asian American studies, did it
Uh,
start to begin around the 1970s?
yeah, the field of Asian American studies started with ethnic studies. It came out of San Francisco State, where I teach now, about 51 years ago, 52 years ago. We had the longest college student strike ever, 6 month struggle, and they founded the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State. So it became an academic field around that time. And so I took Asian American Studies maybe 20 years after its founding, began to go to grad school 30 years after its founding. So there was really little research on Asian Americans and religion. And ethnic studies background tend to be Marxian in approach. And so they sort of saw religion as the opiate of the masses. And so they sort of early on didn't really study the role of religion in the community's life. But, like every community, religion has a major impact. And so it's significant both in the political, mobilization of the community and, the mental health of the community and so many aspects of it.
When did a focus in on like religion and or spirituality come into play when it came to Asian American studies and the relationship between Asian Americans and the role of religion?
Yeah, so again, we have different institutions. So Asian American studies as an academic field started in the late 60s. At the same time, because of the civil rights movement and the student movements, denominational caucuses, Asian American church people were also organizing, trying to come up with their own sense of identity, their own sense of theology. So they began, at least especially in mainline denominations, creating caucuses, groups of ethnic churches coming together to resist white assimilation and to rediscover their Asian Americanness. By the mid 70s, early 80s, then seminaries began to develop Asian American theological institutes, and that's when you began to see more literature published and more research on Asian American theology. So while you have Asian American studies in secular schools, in religious studies, and in theology, maybe 10, 15 years afterwards came Asian American study of religion and theology. So again, it was mostly mainline evangelicals, because they have the sense, we just have a universal transcendent approach to the scriptures. Race really doesn't matter. They didn't really start addressing the role of race, either in interpreting scriptures or shaping our church life until much, much later. And that's why, Princeton is just beginning its institute and trying to incorporate a lot of evangelical research into their work.
That's fascinating. As you've been following this, what have been some of the themes that have been very important in Asian American studies that have related to some of the themes that are covered in Asian American theology?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if you look at Asian American theology, a lot of the early writings dealt with liminality and marginality. So it was first a recognition, while as a racial group, we really do face oppression similar to other communities of color. And we have to understand white supremacy and systems of racial oppression and how that shaped our theology and our understanding. Later on, Asian American theology, I really respect theologians because they really do use current literature. And so they began to incorporate a lot of the current sociological approaches, critical race approaches. And so now they use a lot of different types of analyses. So beyond understanding how Asian Americans are an oppressed racialized group, they began then quickly to use an intersectional approach. So Asian American feminist theologians centered women and looked at how religion impacts them and how they impact their, church life. So there's a lot of feminist writings. And then the other big change in Asian American studies is because in the beginning we studied a lot about the role of race and how we belong to the United States because we're trying to claim the United States. Then we had a transnational turn to say, we're not just Americans, but we're also Asians, and to look at that transnational impact. And so you have a transnational, intersectional, racial approach in both Asian American studies and Asian American theology now, I think.
The Asian American perspective on theology is super important, especially dealing with issues of oppression. And it reminds me a lot of Black liberation theology.
Yeah, it's really similar. It's a lot of Asian American theology can fall under liberation theologies. And from Asia, there's a lot of liberation theologies too, coming from Asia. Jeung theology. And the other thing that we do in Asian American studies and in Asian American theology is we really take a hybridic approach, right? That what we're trying to do is connect different cultural perspectives, racialized perspectives, indigenous perspectives to American perspectives. So we use English, but we try to incorporate different concepts like Han from Korea, or I developed an approach called Li, which is a Confucian perspective in understanding religion. And so I think that trying to use indigenous understandings rather than Western understandings are really helpful in both making Asian American theology resonate with Asian American lives, and also as being sort of a alternative to Western colonized perspectives.
Hey, thank you so much for checking out this video clip from the Delgado podcast. To get more videos like this, simply subscribe here on YouTube. You can also download the full episode of each show on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or your favorite podcast player. Take care.